The dining room at Cascade smelled like seared butter and candle wax, and Maren Voss had learned to move through it the way water moves around stone. Quiet, quick, never splashing. She was 21, knew enough that her hands still shook when she opened wine in front of a table, and she had worked at the restaurant for 4 months without once looking a guest directly in the eye for longer than a heartbeat. That was the rule she had given herself. Look, smile, look away. Guests at Cascade did not want to be seen noticing the waitstaff, and Maren had decided a long time ago that the safest place in any room was the one nobody remembered. Table 12 had been empty all night, roped off with a small brass sign that said reserved, until 9:40, when 4 men in dark suits walked in without being announced, and the maitre d' nearly tripped over his own feet getting to them. Maren was refilling water glasses 2 tables over and felt the shift in the room before she understood it. Conversations dropped in volume. A busser froze mid-step. Somebody's fork clinked too loud against a plate, and the sound seemed to embarrass the whole restaurant. She looked up because everyone else had stopped looking. The man at the center of the 4 wore a charcoal suit cut, so precisely it did not wrinkle when he sat, and his shirt was open 1 button past professional. No tie, like formality was something he allowed rather than something he needed. His hair was black and combed back without a single strand loose. He had a scar through one eyebrow, thin and old, silver-white against his skin, and his eyes were dark enough that from across the room they looked like 2 closed doors. He did not glance around the restaurant the way new guests usually did, cataloging the chandeliers and the wine list and the other diners. He simply sat, and the room reorganized itself around his stillness. The maitre d' came to find her 3 minutes later, his voice pitched low and urgent. "Table 12 wants you specifically," he said.
"Not Arya. Not Ben. You."
Maren's stomach dropped. "I don't know them," she said. "They asked for the new girl," he said. "That's you." She had never served table 12 before. Nobody had, not in the 4 months she'd worked there. It was the table reserved for people the owner called friends of the house, the kind of friends who paid for silence rather than food. She smoothed her apron with both hands, a habit she hated in herself, and walked toward the table like she was walking toward a test she hadn't studied for. "Good evening," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "My name's Maren. I'll be taking care of you tonight." 3 of the men didn't look at her at all. The 4th, the one with the scar through his eyebrow, did. He looked at her the way some people looked at a locked door, assessing the hinges before deciding whether it was worth opening. "Maren," he repeated, like it was a word he was testing in his mouth. He said it slower than anyone ever had, like her name had more syllables than she'd known. "What do you recommend, Maren?" She should have recited the specials. Instead, without meaning to, she said, "Whatever you order, you won't finish because you don't look like a man who lets himself enjoy things all the way." The table went silent in a different way than before. Not fear this time, but attention. One of the other men actually laughed, short and surprised, before catching himself. The man with the scar studied her for 3 full seconds. Then, for the first time that night, something moved behind his eyes that wasn't calculation. "Bring me the duck," he said. "And bring yourself back to check if I finished it." His name, she would learn before the night ended, was Taejun Bak, and he owned a great deal more of the city than the restaurant's owner would ever admit out loud. Taejun did finish the duck. Maren noticed because she counted the seconds it took her to walk back to the table, bracing herself the entire way for whatever version of him would be waiting, annoyed, indifferent, already gone. Instead, he sat with the plate cleared and his glass barely touched, watching the door like he was waiting for a threat that hadn't arrived yet. "You were wrong," he said, before she could ask. "I was wrong," she agreed, and found she wasn't afraid of admitting it. That surprised her more than his attention had. He didn't smile, but something in his jaw eased. The other 3 men left 20 minutes later, folded into a black car idling at the curb, and Taejun stayed behind at a table meant for 4, alone, nursing a second glass of wine he didn't seem to want. Maren refilled his water, without being asked. She was good at reading tables, the ones that wanted to be left alone, the ones that wanted company disguised as service, and she still couldn't read him. "You don't have to babysit the empty chairs," he said when she came by a 3rd time. "I'm not babysitting," she said. "I'm working. There's a difference." He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that made her feel catalogued rather than seen. Most people who work a room like this learn to disappear, he said. You don't disappear. You noticed the room shift before your manager did. I noticed things, she said, because it felt true and safer than silence. That's a dangerous habit, he said, in a place like this. She didn't know yet what he meant by a place like this, whether he meant the restaurant or the city or something else entirely, and she didn't ask. But 3 nights later, when she left through the back alley at 11:40 after her shift, the same black car was parked half a block down, engine running, headlights off, and she understood without being told that whatever her noticing had cost her, it wasn't finished being paid. She almost turned back inside. Instead, she kept walking because turning back would have meant admitting she was afraid, and Maren Voss had built her whole life around never admitting that out loud. The car door opened before she reached it. Taejun stepped out into the orange wash of the streetlight, jacket unbuttoned, hands loose at his sides in a way that still looked coiled, like stillness that hadn't decided yet whether it needed to become motion. There's a man across the street who has been watching this alley for 11 minutes, he said, quiet and even like he was commenting on weather. He is not watching for you. He is watching for me. But he will use you to get to me if given the chance, and I would rather you didn't give him that chance tonight. Maren's pulse climbed into her throat. Then you should leave, she said. Not talk to me on a sidewalk where he can see us together. Too late for that, Taejun said, and for the first time, she heard something under the calm. Not fear. He didn't seem built for fear, but a kind of tired certainty, like a man who had done this math 1,000 times and always arrived at the same uncomfortable answer. He already saw us together 3 nights ago. That is why he is here now.
I don't understand what I did, she said.
You looked at me and didn't flinch, he said. That's rarer than you think in my line of work. People flinch. You didn't. He noticed. Now I have to make sure that noticing doesn't cost you your life. He walked her home that night, 3 blocks in a silence that felt less like danger and more like negotiation between 2 people deciding how much truth the other could handle. At her building's door, he stopped 2 steps back, respecting a boundary she hadn't voiced, and told her plainly, without softening it, what he was. Not a businessman with unfortunate friends. Not a man who occasionally kept dangerous company. The head of an organization that controlled a significant portion of the city's underground economy, inherited from a father who had built it on the same cold discipline Taejun now wore like a second skin. I'm telling you this, he said, because you deserve to know exactly what you're being pulled into before it pulls you in the rest of the way. Most people who work for me spend years learning what I just told you in 30 seconds. I don't know why I'm telling you now. Maybe because I asked, she said. You didn't ask, he said. You just didn't run. Running still felt like an option that night. It stopped feeling like one 4 days later, when a man she didn't recognize sat down at one of her tables during the dinner rush, ordered nothing, and asked her, casually, terrifyingly casually, how well she knew Mr. Bach. She said the truth, that she barely knew him at all, and the man smiled like he didn't believe her, left $100 bill on an empty table, and told her to enjoy her night. She called the number Taejun had given her, a number he'd written on a napkin, not a business card, like he'd wanted the gesture to feel disposable even as it mattered, and he arrived at the restaurant within 11 minutes of her voicemail, his calm replaced by something sharper, more focused, a man walking into a room already deciding where every exit was. Describe him, Taejun said, and she did, and something in his face closed like a door. That's Yoon Suk, he said. He works for Choi Dae-hyun. Dae-hyun has wanted my territory for 2 years and has never once cared who he burns down to get it. Why would he come to me? Maren asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. Because I made a mistake, Taejun said, and it was the first time she heard something close to guilt in his voice. I let myself be seen caring about someone who isn't supposed to matter to men like me. Dae-hyun doesn't need to hurt me. He just needs to hurt someone I would never forgive myself for losing. The words landed harder than she expected. You said that like you already have someone in mind, she said carefully. Someone you lost. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then my older sister, Min Young. She was 26. She worked at a gallery, had nothing to do with any of this, and a rival organization killed her 11 years ago because they wanted my father to feel what it cost to be feared. I was 19. I promised myself I would never again let someone close enough to be used as a weapon against me.
And now?
Marin asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. Now I'm standing in your restaurant for the second time in a week, he said, breaking his own rule in real time, and I don't know how to stop.
He didn't stop.
Over the following 2 weeks, Taejun found reasons, thin ones, transparent ones, to be near her. He'd appear at Cascade during her shifts, always at table 12, always ordering the duck he never finished a second time, always staying until close so he could walk her the 3 blocks home through streets he'd quietly had cleared of anyone who might be watching. Marin told herself this was safety, not courtship, though the distinction blurred a little more each night. The tenderness, when it came, arrived small and almost accidental. One night it rained hard enough that the awning outside Cascade did nothing to stop the water from soaking through her thin uniform jacket, and Taejun, without a word, shrugged out of his own suit jacket and settled it over her shoulders before she could protest. It smelled like cedar and something warmer underneath, bergamot maybe, and it was too big for her in a way that felt less like a costume and more like an admission. You'll ruin it, she said, meaning the jacket, meaning something else too. It's fabric, he said. I have others. I don't have many people who tell me the truth without flinching. That's harder to replace. She almost asked him what he meant. Instead, she found herself asking something more dangerous. Does Choi Dae-hyun know you're doing this? Walking me home. Standing in the rain for me. He knows everything eventually, Taejun said. That's the nature of men like him. The question isn't whether he knows. The question is what he decides to do with the knowing. 3 days later she found out. She left work at her usual time, expecting the familiar black car, and instead found the alley empty and a folded note tucked beneath her windshield wiper. She didn't own a car, she realized with a cold drop in her stomach, which meant someone had chosen this specific spot, this specific timing, deliberately. The note contained 4 words. He can't protect everyone. She called Taejun immediately, and for the first time she heard real urgency in his voice, the calm cracking at the edges like ice under weight. Stay where you are, he said. Don't walk. Don't wait outside. I'm 8 minutes away. He was there in 6. When he arrived, jaw tight, eyes scanning the alley with a precision that made her realize how much restraint he usually kept wrapped around himself, she made a choice that surprised her more than it surprised him. She didn't wait for him to guide her to the car. She grabbed his arm, actually grabbed it, fingers closing around fabric and muscle, and said, "We need to move now, not in 30 seconds, because if he wanted me dead, I'd already be dead. He wants you to see something." Where would he put it? Taejun stared at her for 1 full second, something shifting behind his eyes that looked almost like respect colliding with fear for her. "The loading dock," he said. "Behind the restaurant. It's the only blind spot from the street cameras." She was already moving before he finished the sentence, and this time, it was Taejun following her lead. The loading dock behind Cascade sat in near total darkness, one flickering bulb over the delivery door the only light, and what waited there wasn't a body, not what she'd braced for in the 6 seconds it took to cross the distance. It was worse in a smaller way. A message meant to wound rather than kill. Someone had taken the framed photograph from the restaurant's private dining room, the one of the owner shaking hands with local dignitaries, and replaced the owner's face with a printed photo of Marin's, crudely taped over it, a single word scrawled across the glass in what she prayed was red marker and knew, somehow wasn't. Careful. Taejun went very still beside her, the particular stillness she'd learned by now to fear more than shouting. "This isn't a message for me," he said, voice flattened into something dangerous. "This is a message that he can reach you whenever he decides to. He wants me to know that protecting you makes you a target, not the reverse." "Then let him know it worked," Marin said, surprising herself with how steady her voice came out. "Tell him I'm not leaving. Tell him scaring me only tells me how close I already am to whatever this is." "You don't understand what you're agreeing to," Taejun said, turning to face her fully, something raw breaking through the composure he wore like armor. Dae-hyun doesn't stop. He didn't stop with my sister. He won't stop with you unless I end this permanently, and ending it permanently means blood, means risk, means possibly losing everything I've spent 11 years building to keep this exact thing from happening again. Then why haven't you already sent me away?
She asked.
You could have. You could have decided I wasn't worth the complication the first night that car followed me home. Why didn't you? He looked at her for a long moment in the flickering dark, the shadows carving his face into something almost unbearably honest. Because you are the first person in 11 years who looked at what I am and didn't decide I was only that, he said. Everyone else sees the suit, the organization, the reputation. You saw a man who finishes his duck too slowly because he doesn't let himself enjoy things. Nobody has looked at me like that since my sister died. The confession sat between them, heavier than either of them seemed prepared for. Maren felt something crack open in her chest, something she'd kept carefully sealed since the first night she'd noticed the room shift around him. I told myself walking you those 3 blocks was about keeping you safe, she admitted, quiet, unguarded in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. I've been lying. I looked forward to it. I looked forward to you. Taejun's hand rose, hesitated an inch from her face, like a man still deciding whether he'd earned the right to touch something he wanted this badly. Maren closed the distance herself, and when his hand finally settled against her jaw, his palm was warm despite the cold night, and neither of them pulled away. They didn't kiss that night. Not yet. Not with Daehyun's message still glowing faintly on broken glass 6 feet away, but something between them had shifted permanently, an acknowledgement that couldn't be unspoken again. Taejun called 2 of his men to handle the loading dock, his voice clipped and businesslike even as his hand stayed at the small of Maren's back, and by the time they left, the photograph was gone, the glass was gone, and only the memory of the red word remained, tucked somewhere Maren knew she wouldn't fully shake. He drove her home himself that night instead of sending her with a driver, and at her door, he paused the way he always did, respecting the 2-step distance she'd unconsciously established weeks earlier. This time, though, he didn't stop there. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Even if the honest answer is one I don't want, he said. Do you want out? Not because I'll think less of you. Because I would rather lose you to safety than lose you to Daehyun. Maren thought about her small apartment, her 4 months at Cascade, the life she'd built out of careful invisibility and the safe habit of never being noticed. She thought about the version of herself who would have run the first night that black car idled outside the alley. If I wanted out, she said, I would have taken it 3 weeks ago. I'm not asking you to make this safe. I'm telling you I'm staying regardless of whether it is. He exhaled like she'd handed him something he hadn't let himself hope for. Then I need to tell you what staying actually means, he said. Daehyun won't stop with warnings. His next move will be direct, and it will likely come sooner than either of us wants. If you're staying, I need you close enough that I can protect you, which means moving you somewhere more secure than this apartment, at least until this is finished. She should have argued. Instead, 3 nights later, she found herself in a penthouse 2 floors below Taejun's own, in a building she hadn't known he owned entirely, surrounded by security she both resented and quietly appreciated. It was during those nights, waiting for a war she couldn't fully see the shape of, that she learned the smaller truths about him, that he read poetry in a language she didn't speak but loved the sound of anyway, that he hadn't visited his sister's grave in 3 years because the guilt had gotten too heavy to carry there, that his hands, capable of the violence she'd witnessed once from a distance, were unfailingly gentle every single time they touched her. On the 9th night, in a kitchen too large for one man living mostly alone, she finally asked him to show her the grave, and he looked at her like she'd offered him something he didn't know how to accept. They went the next morning, before the city fully woke, to a quiet cemetery on the northern edge of Seoul, where the Bok family plot sat beneath old pine trees. Taejun stood in front of his sister's headstone with a composure that cracked slightly at the edges, the first time Maren had seen him look less than certain of every movement his body made. She would have liked you, he said finally, crouching to clear leaves from the base of the stone with the same careful precision he brought to everything. She didn't like anyone I brought around. Said most people were afraid of me before they'd even met me, and afraid people make bad company. You weren't afraid. I was afraid, Marin said honestly. I just decided fear wasn't a good enough reason to leave. He looked up at her, something unguarded passing across his face in the gray morning light. That's the difference, he said. Everyone else let the fear decide for them. You didn't. They didn't get long to sit with the quiet. Taejun's phone rang before they'd left the cemetery gates, and the voice on the other end, she could hear the tension even from a foot away, made his whole posture change, shoulders dropping into the flat, dangerous stillness she now recognized as the moment before violence. Dae-hyun had moved. Not against Taejun directly, but against Cascade itself, a fire set deliberately in the kitchen during the lightest overnight shift, timed, they would later learn, for a night when the schedule would have placed Marin working alone in the back. She wasn't there. A last-minute schedule change, unrelated to any of this, had put her on a day shift instead. But the fact remained, cold and undeniable. Dae-hyun had aimed for her, and missed only by accident. That's it, Taejun said, voice dropped into something Marin had never heard from him, something with no negotiation left in it. This ends now. Not defensively. Not waiting for his next move. I end this today, on my terms, before he decides to try again and gets it right. I'm coming with you, Marin said, before he could tell her to stay behind. Absolutely not, he said. This isn't a conversation. It's not a request either, she said, meeting the flat certainty in his eyes with her own. You said it yourself. I'm already a target. Hiding me somewhere safe doesn't change that. It only means I'm not there to help end it. I've watched you move through danger, like it's a language you speak fluently. Let me speak a different language back. I notice things.
Let me use that.
The meeting Taejun arranged with Choi Dae-hyun took place in a shipping warehouse near the harbor, neutral ground by the underworld's unspoken rules, though neutral. Marin understood by the tension radiating from every man in Taejun's small escort was a word that meant very little once violence had already been set into motion. Dae-hyun arrived with 6 men to Taejun's 4, and Marin stood a careful 2 steps behind Taejun's shoulder, close enough to see, far enough to not immediately register as a target, exactly the position he'd insisted on, and she'd reluctantly accepted. Dae-hyun was smaller than she expected, compact and precise in his own gray suit, with the kind of smile that looked practiced rather than felt. You brought your girl, he said, eyes flicking to Marin with an interest that made her skin crawl. I burned her workplace and you brought her to a meeting with the man who did it. Sentimental. Your father would be disappointed. My father is dead, Taejun said, voice utterly level. And you set a fire in a building full of people who had nothing to do with either of us to send a message to me. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of man I'm dealing with. The kind of man who takes what he wants, Dae-hyun said, and the shift in his posture was subtle but unmistakable. A man deciding the negotiation portion of the evening had concluded. It happened fast after that, the kind of violence Marin had only witnessed once before, at a distance, and this time stood close enough to feel the concussion of it in her chest. One of Dae-hyun's men moved toward Taejun's blind side, and it was Marin who saw it first, who shouted a single sharp warning that gave Taejun the half-second he needed to turn and meet the threat before it became fatal. The warehouse dissolved into controlled chaos, and Marin, rather than freezing, grabbed a length of steel pipe from a nearby pallet and used it to redirect a second attacker's arm just enough that Taejun's return strike landed clean. It was over in under 2 minutes. Dae-hyun himself, cornered and finally out of options, out of men, out of the composure he'd walked in with, made the mistake of reaching for a weapon Taejun's men had somehow missed searching, and Taejun closed the distance between them before the weapon fully cleared its holster. What followed, Marin understood without needing it explained further, was the ending Taejun had always known this required, the ending 11 years of grief and discipline had built toward. When it was finished, Taejun stood in the wreckage of a warehouse and a war 11 years in the making, breathing hard, blood on his knuckles that wasn't his own, and turned to find Marin still standing, pipe in hand, exactly where he'd left her. You're supposed to stay behind me, he said, but there was no real reprimand in it, only something closer to awe. I did stay behind you, she said. I just didn't stay useless. The days after Dae-hyun's death moved strangely, The particular quiet that follows violence finally spent, the exhaustion of a war finally oversettling into both of them like something they'd have to learn to carry differently now that there was nothing left to fight. Taejun's organization absorbed the resulting territory without much resistance, the way these things apparently did once the man at the top was gone, and within a week the city had quietly reorganized itself around a new, uncontested order. Marin went back to Cascade once, to see the damage from the fire, standing in the scorched kitchen with an ache in her chest she hadn't expected. The owner told her, gently, that the restaurant would need months to reopen, if it reopened at all, and Marin realized, standing in the ruin of the place that had given her the safety of invisibility for 4 months, that she didn't want that safety back. She didn't want to disappear into a room anymore. She stood there a long moment longer, running her palm along a countertop scorched black at one edge, and thought about the version of herself who had walked into this kitchen 4 months ago terrified of being noticed by anyone at all. That version of her would not recognize the woman standing here now, a woman who had grabbed a length of pipe in a warehouse without hesitating, who had shouted a warning that saved a man's life, who had chosen, again and again, to stay visible even when invisibility would have cost her nothing. The fire had taken the walls and the ceiling and most of what used to be the walk-in refrigerator, but it had not taken that. Nothing had managed to take that. She thought, too, about Yoon-suk and the man with the $100 bill and the note tucked under a windshield wiper on a car she'd never owned, and how none of it had broken her the way it had probably been designed to. Fear had visited her plenty of times over the last several months. It had simply stopped being the thing that decided what she did next. Taejun found her there, in the burned kitchen, and stood beside her without speaking for a long moment. "I keep thinking about what you said," she told him finally. "That I was the first person who looked at you and didn't decide you were only what you are. I need you to know something too. I spent my whole life deciding the safest place in any room was the one where nobody remembered me. You're the first person who made staying visible feel worth the risk." He turned to face her fully, something in his expression stripped of every careful wall he usually kept in place. "I don't know how to be the kind of man who deserves that," he admitted. "Everything I am was built to survive, not to be worthy of someone choosing to stay." "Then let me decide that part," Marin said. "You don't get to protect me from that choice too." He kissed her then, finally, in the ash and ruin of the place where all of this had started, careful at first, and then not careful at all, and it felt less like the beginning of something soft, and more like the closing of a door that had been open too long, letting in danger neither of them had chosen but both of them had survived. 3 months later, Cascade reopened under new ownership, Taejun's, though he kept his name off every document that mattered, preferring the fiction that let Marin walk through the front door as a guest rather than an employee whenever she wanted. She didn't work there anymore. She'd gone back to school instead, something she'd wanted long before any of this began, funded quietly and without condition by a man who understood, better than most, what it meant to build a life on your own terms after nearly losing the chance to build one at all.
She still noticed things.
That never changed. The way Taejun's shoulders tightened slightly before he entered any room with more than one unfamiliar face in it. The way he still ordered the duck at Cascade and still, some nights, didn't finish it, though now she understood it wasn't restraint but distraction, a man learning slowly how to let himself enjoy something without waiting for it to be taken away. On a quiet evening in early spring, sitting across from him at the same table where all of it had begun, table 12, no longer roped off, no longer reserved for anyone but them, Marin asked him the question she'd been circling for weeks. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Any of it? The war? What it cost you? What it nearly cost me?" Taejun considered the question with the same careful precision he brought to everything, turning his wine glass slowly between 2 fingers. "I regret that it took my sister's death and nearly yours for me to understand what mattering to someone actually costs," he said finally. "I don't regret a single choice I made once I understood it. Not one." "And if it happened again," she asked, "if some new threat came for everything you've built, would you choose differently? Would you send me away to keep me safe?" He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his eyes, the same eyes that had looked like 2 closed doors the first night she'd noticed him across a crowded room, had opened permanently, The way she now understood some doors, once unlocked, simply refused to close again. No, he said simply. I learned that lesson once already. I would rather face every danger this city can throw at us with you beside me than survive it alone, and call that safety. Marin reached across the table and took his hand, the same hand she'd once watched move through violence like a language he'd been born speaking, and found, as she always did now, that it was warm and steady and entirely hers.